Thank you so much. I am just thrilled to be here. I've known Shane since we're trying to figure it out. I think it was 2003 or 2004. So really at the beginning of PebblePad, and really at the beginning of when many of us around the world, I would say, were starting to do work with portfolios. And I've actually never been to any kind of a user conference. So I've been to lots of educational technology conferences and things. So it's really wonderful to hear all of your stories about the work that you're doing with PebblePad. And congratulations to all of you, because I think you're really embodying the kind of thinking that I try to promote in my own teaching and in the work that I do with other campuses and colleagues. I live in beautiful British Columbia, Canada. I lived in Ontario, which is on the east side of Canada, for my whole life until 2 years ago when I moved to BC. This is actually not in Kamloops. This is more Vancouver Island. But I did want to give you the sense of how lovely it is. My area is actually more in the desert, but lovely in a whole different way. And this is a photo I took on vacation with my mom just earlier this summer. Really wanted to think with you about this notion of I am still learning, which some of you may know comes from Michelangelo. He said it around in his 80s. And I love that idea because I think that's, for me, what I really try to promote with my students and what I want them to, the skill I want them to develop as they work through their work with me. So I'll talk a little bit about that whole idea of what I mean by I am still learning and give you, well, you saw a good example. Always learning on lots of different fronts, but learning really in the context of portfolios and future readiness. And then think about who should be still learning. And sometimes I think we work on campuses that are learning organizations, and it's sometimes a bit of a challenge to get all of our stakeholders learning with us, and so I'll talk a little bit about that. And then some work that I'm doing right now that is kind of focused on how can we develop personal pathways and portfolios for continuing learning as we move through the learning career. So learning portfolios and future readiness, what do we need to know? I think, as Shane pointed out, PebblePad is quite a unique system, as you all know, because it is pedagogically focused, and it comes from how can we best engage not only learners but also instructors with thinking about how to do this work well. And I think that portfolios really are best when we use them to document learning in different contexts. And I'm not sure I'll put that LAPSEC video in my portfolio, but that would be something to consider. I think if they're not process oriented, or in other words, if they don't include some kind of folio thinking, it's not really a portfolio as far as I'm concerned, although there's not one single agreed upon definition of portfolio. So many people would say it is a showcase, it's something for employers. I think if that reflective element is not there, to me it's not a portfolio, and I would never design a portfolio implementation without that. And it should, I think, highlight the learner's pathway in whatever context we're working with them. So I have lots of course-specific portfolios where I'm working with the students over a semester. We have program-based portfolios, and in either of those cases, institutional portfolios, it should document what's the pathway, what kind of learning has happened over time. And I think, to me, those are essential elements in all portfolios. So just to give you an example, I am still learning in lots of different contexts, and I really work hard to bring all of that kind of thinking into my class. This is me on a hike, what you might call in the UK a walk. This wasn't really a walk. My friend said to me, oh, you should do the Grouse Grind. So Grouse Mountain is in North Vancouver, and I was there working with another university. We went early so we could do the Grouse Grind. And I started up, you know, it's like, oh, this is so exciting, I'm gonna walk up this. It is literally 2,800 stairs straight up the side of the mountain. And so they have these, you can hardly see it, but these trail markers. And we got to like 12 of 40, and I'm looking at my partner saying, what the hell are we doing? It's awful. And where's the switchback that takes you across the mountain? So he posted the first picture on Facebook, which is me trying to be like, I'm really hating this. I don't think it's like trying to look. And then, you know, finally when we got to 39 of 40 and think, thank goodness it's almost over. And then finally 40 out of 40. And so that, you know, it might not seem connected to higher education, but that's often what our portfolio journeys are like, right? Really excited, we're gonna use portfolios, our students are gonna love it. Oh my gosh, 2 weeks in, they're complaining, they maybe don't understand what we're doing, we maybe haven't thought of, I mean, I did hear yesterday some stories about here's where things kind of went off the rails. We had really good ideas and plans, and we have this great system, but you can, as Shane pointed out, use any fantastic system badly if you haven't really thought it through. And so I think that kind of marathon get to the end of the trail is really crucial. And I don't think in our work there's really an end to the trail. It's an ongoing process. And I try to really bring that into my own portfolio, which is totally a work in progress. This is my professional portfolio. I have others where I'm really trying to help people understand where I'm coming from as a scholar. I've had a somewhat unconventional academic upbringing in that I worked on my doctoral degree whilst I was having babies and needed to find a job when my funding ran out, and ended up at the Center for Teaching and Learning as a graduate teaching assistant. And then from there my job kind of ran out, and they were starting a Center for Learning and Teaching Through Technology, and I said to the guy who was going to be the director, you got any jobs over there? I'm thinking I gotta buy diapers and, you know, broccoli. And so he said, yeah, come on over, and really allowed me to sort of work on projects that I created, gave me lots of opportunities to learn stuff, and then went on to be a faculty member where I've used some of this kind of thinking. So it's sometimes early in my career it felt a little bit like I had a schizophrenic life, because I was doing learning and teaching things on the one hand, and then my disciplinary scholarship on the other. I'm a historian by training, and then when I started to do portfolio work, I realized, oh, it's very integrated, and so I think the portfolio gives me an opportunity to kind of bring together all of that work in a way that's meaningful to me and hopefully to others. And I think that's what that whole idea of meaning making and authentic evidence is so important. And I think that's where we really need to keep in mind that our learners are also constituted by their experiences. This quote comes from historian Joan Scott, where she talked about sort of evidence that we didn't normally see in the past. So in particular, she was talking about, she was doing queer history and sort of saying we need to, in a period where we weren't doing queer history yet, and so just thinking about how we could use that evidence of experience to help us better understand the past. And I've been playing a lot with this quote because I think we need to really consider how the learners that come to us are shaped and constituted through their experiences. Sometimes we get them, not you, but in higher education more generally, and we want to put them all through exactly the same process. We want to stick them in a course. We're going to get them to move through a program in a particular way without really asking them, how does this connect to other things that you've done, other learning that you've had? And so I think keeping that idea that their evidence of experience is really important and ought to drive and get privileged throughout their university education is so important. And to me, this quote is really shaping the kind of thinking that I'm doing about portfolios, particularly because my institution now is a lot of first-generation learners, lots of international students. We have First Nations students or our Indigenous students in Canada. Quite different from the research-intensive university that I came from, where we had high flyers and that kind of thing. And it's really been remarkable for me to meet the students on our current campus and talk to them about how they got to Thompson Rivers. You know, what prompted them to come to university. They know a lot of stuff. They're really smart. They have lots of experiences, but sometimes those learners come through the system thinking that they're not as bright or maybe not ready. And I think that we can reframe that quite nicely by asking them to document what evidence of experience of learning have they got already, how are they making connections in ways that are meaningful for them, which I have to say, when I do that in my classes, it makes my job so much better, because I get to see the ways, and I'll show you some examples in a second. My learners are making connections to things that they're doing that are quite different things than I did when I was an undergraduate. So it just illuminates for me who they are as people, and gives me a sense of where else they're learning. And I will say, even for my research, it has driven my research in different directions, because they ask these questions and make connections that I think, oh, I didn't take that gender sociology class. I wouldn't have thought to ask that question or to do things, and really working with them to answer some of those research questions is quite exciting. I think when we think about portfolio pedagogy and future readiness, we can't help, and I think Gregor quite nicely, sort of shared thoughts on this with us yesterday, we can't not think about the broader competencies that we need our learners to develop to be successful for life in the 21st century in a very globalized world. The 7 C's competencies for learning and leading come from a group in Canada that's doing work on 21st century learning, and you'll see that they're quite similar to the image that Gregor shared yesterday with the different content and competencies that we need to develop in our learners. And I also love this work from AAC&U. Carol Geary-Schneider, their former president, talked about the kinds of abilities that needed to be developed with our learners today. This whole idea of broad, big picture learning. I mean, when I look at that, I think, oh, it's integrative learning, it's making connections. We've been talking about that for quite some time. And then recently, out of Stanford's design school, they did a project called Stanford 2025, where they were visioning the future of higher education, which isn't necessarily totally doable. But you should watch the video, and I'm happy to share these slides, because Sarah just is a great thought provoker, and I think that's what the project was really intended to do. But she asks the question, what are our students' missions? Rather than thinking about what do you want to be when you grow up, or what career are you pursuing while you're here working with us, what's your mission? How do you want to engage with the world at some point in the future? And I like that idea of thinking about, because frankly, most of my students are not going to become historians. They're coming because they need, in fact, I asked my first year class last week, how many of you are here because you just love pre-Confederation Canadian history and you couldn't bear to miss this course? No hands. How many of you are here because you love history generally and you wanted to? No hands. How many are here because it's an elective and you needed to get this credit? All the hands went up, right? So it's sort of this, interesting challenge where how do I engage them in a meaningful way with content that they're probably not all that interested in, and neither am I. It's not really my favorite course to teach. And so I think that's, thinking about how we can help them make connections to what they're learning is super important. This is an early example from a course that I taught at the University of Waterloo, the first class where I ever used portfolios, and it really demonstrates for me even today the power of portfolios to allow students to make connections more broadly in the learning that's happening. Chris was a history major, and but he was not typical in the class that we were in. The class was called History and Film. Again, one of those ones where students were like, ooh, easy A, I'm going to go watch movies every week. But Chris, was different than some of the other students who were from engineering or accounting who connected in different ways. But I thought it was really interesting that, just the idea that he had an opportunity to reflect on and make connections between what he was learning in that class and other learning that was happening for him was really powerful. And I think that it speaks to how really great learning designs that integrate portfolios very intentionally can produce this sort of opportunity for students to reflect on and think about how can I use this and where can I go next with my learning. Haley is a student at Thompson Rivers University, and she was one of our engagement ambassadors. I used to run the Center for Student Engagement and Learning Innovation. And when we introduced portfolios to TRU, it was really more of an integrative, let's think about how you can bridge your curricular and co-curricular learning. So not course specific or program specific, but rather as more of a co-curricular activity. And when Haley sort of said, well, I did stuff in high school. Could I put that in my portfolio? And she was on her way to being a graduating student. And I said, of course, bring in whatever is meaningful for you and whatever makes sense. And so she did that. She's really interested in photography. She took it as an opportunity to actually create her own book of her photography and to sell it on her portfolio, which I was like, okay, well wasn't an outcome we had planned, but in reflecting on, they would go out and show their portfolios on the campus, and she came back and she said, readers of my portfolio are treating me like the expert on me, right? And of course, we all are the experts on ourselves. We all know ourselves best. But this was the first time she'd had that opportunity to really think that way and think about how she might present herself to an outside audience. And I think that was, for me, quite exciting. So we've got all of these various uses of portfolios, but we are working in the context of big learning organizations, and it's not always easy. Anybody here the only person in their department that's doing portfolios, or one of a few? Like, I'm the only person doing it, right? Not within a course context or a program context, or some of you just doing kind of one-off portfolios? Oh, you are all so lucky. Most of the time when I go to campuses, I'm working with people who are doing it pretty much on their own island. And I think that this is a really important issue for us to consider. How do we embed this kind of thinking into the learning organization? And how do we encourage the learning organization to, and empower the learning organization to really take up the kind of thinking that we know is so powerful in portfolios? That whole notion of reflection, documenting learning. What's the pathway on our campuses? How can we really use portfolios to make that much more visible? We all have mission and vision statements and often strategic priority documents. But I don't know about you, but I've worked on quite a number of campuses, and often, particularly with respect to technology, we don't see an alignment between the things that we purchase and the projects that the institution gets behind and actually what the mission of the institution is. And so I think that's frankly a threshold concept that we need to work on, but we do need to consider. Because we do have calls coming from outside. Employers, for instance, are saying, here's what you should spend more time doing in higher education. Really? Critical thinking and analytic reasoning? Like, these are all things that, of course, this is what we do in higher education. And employers have this perception that we're not doing enough to allow our students to develop these kinds of skills. And so I think that for the learning organization is a huge call for us to sort of be a little bit more explicit and intentional about how we are doing this work. I don't teach history as a story. My students are often quite confused. Why is it not a narrative of what happened in the past? Because that's how they've experienced learning history. My classes are all focused around how do you learn to think historically? And that's true of my first year classes and my fourth year. Obviously, there's some developmental differences and different things I do with them. Because I've had many students over the years in my office at the end of their degree in a panic. Like, what do I know how to do? I have to apply for jobs. I don't even know how to do, like, what do I put on my resume? What do I say? And it seemed to me that we need to do a much better job of making those knowledge, skills, abilities that they're developing in our disciplines quite explicit, and help them make the connection. Oh, right, I wrote a research paper. That was me developing my emerging research abilities, and here's some evidence that shows that I've done that. And here's what it looked like in first year, but now in fourth year, look at how much more developed my thinking is. And so I think we need to give them that opportunity, and we need to be having the conversations with external stakeholders to the institution about how we can help make it more obvious to them what we're doing, and also hear from them about how we can ensure that our graduates are future ready and that they're going to be able to do the things that the employers want them to do. Lots of great opportunities to do this. These are all of the high impact practices from the Association of American Colleges and Universities in the US. They've just added Eportfolios as the 11th high impact practice. I may be giving you a bit of a secret, but it'll be more public shortly. I don't actually think ePortfolios themselves are the 11th high impact practice. I think that portfolios actually help us to do a better job with the others. I sort of see it as more of a meta high impact practice, and that comes from the work of Susan Kahn in the US. But great for us in the context of the learning organization. I don't know how it is here, but in North America, provosts will put money into things that AAC and U are high impact practices. So this will be part of the National Survey of Student Engagement, which many of our campuses administer each year. And so I think it's quite exciting that we have an opportunity to start shaping the learning organization through this high impact practice work. We're all doing it already, but I think it's leverage for us, if you will, in terms of moving our work forward. I think we also need to think about what does the learning career look like on our particular campuses. This comes from Stanford University. This is work of Helen Chen. But we can do this on all of our campuses. You know, what does the learning career look like for students as they move through our various programs on our campuses? Where might we introduce those high impact practices? How are we going to ensure that we introduce this kind of folio thinking? Where can we reinforce it? Where can we help students to really develop proficiency so that they can show external audiences that they understand these various abilities? And so what are some of the ways that we might map that out? I think we sometimes forget to do, I don't know what it's like in other disciplines, but in history, curriculum is usually developed by, you know, you get a new professor, their area is X, and we say, oh, let's add a few courses in that so you can teach in your area, and then, you know, you get this mishmash of things that aren't really integrated. I think we need, if we're going to ask our students to take on this kind of integrative approach to their learning, we ought to be modeling that for them in the way that we design our programs, in the learning designs we employ in our classes, and in the activities that we're asking them to undertake as they're learning in our disciplines. And so I think something like this is really useful, where we consider what are the graduate attributes that we'd like to see of our learners when they leave our programs, and how are we going to ensure they get there? Because otherwise, you just aren't going to have the same kind of success that you would if you map this out this way. This is an example from the program that I left from in the Sexuality, Marriage, and Family Studies program at the University of Waterloo. We had the opportunity to undertake a curriculum redesign. And we really worked hard to think about what are the various skills and abilities that we want to ensure each of our graduates leaves the university with. So ethics was one of the abilities that we really wanted to ensure that as we sent students out into largely human service professions, that they had developed that ability quite well, and that we could say with confidence we had given them the opportunity to really develop and think through those skills over time. So we really intentionally included the portfolio work at beginner, so that introduced stage. In first year, we had a course called Reflection and Action, which, as you can imagine, was very much about responsible citizenship and ethics. I also taught an introduction to couples, marriages, and families, where we talked a lot about ethical behavior in family and relationships. And so we knew that we could guarantee students would hit that particular milestone, and it would be in their portfolio. We then had them developing further their abilities and their thinking about ethics in a course that I taught called Sexual Ethics. And then finally, I used to say that we mastered in fourth year, but really I don't think any of us really masters these things ever. We enabled their developing proficiency, is how I'm saying it now, in the fourth year, where they had a capstone project and they used the portfolio to bring together all the learning that had happened and the evidence that demonstrated that they'd met the various graduate attributes. And so I think that program is, I feel really proud of it. It was a great success for us to have thought through at the programmatic level how we would do this in a very intentional way, and how we would make it obvious and explicit to students that that's what they were doing when they were learning with us. And so I think it was quite exciting. And this is Tyra's portfolio from that Introduction to Couples, Marriages, and Families class. And I love this example because she was a student, or is a student with disabilities, and I sort of say in my classes, you know, one of the things I really want you to get out of this is a better understanding of yourself. Who am I? What does that mean for my learning in this particular program? Where do I want to go next? And so I had provided, because it was a first-year course, a template for them for their portfolio. And she has very cleverly, at the top, added a section called Understanding Thyself, where she really thinks about, where did I come from? How did I get to this particular program? What is shaping my thinking about all of the different aspects of couples, marriages, and families that we're learning about in this class? And here's some other classes and experiences that I've had that have also shaped my learning. And so I think when we very intentionally design learning to happen this way, you know, students really have an opportunity to shine and to show who they are as they're working through our various programs. So we saw earlier the slide that employers are advocating that we develop those particular skills in our graduates and need to do a better job of it. There's also calls for the learning organization to do a better job of showing to other outside stakeholders that we are making these gains, that we're actually doing things that make sense to a real world audience. And so I think that keeping that in mind as we design our portfolio work is really important. Who are the stakeholders that might be interested in the work that we're doing, not only on our campuses, but also externally? And I thought it was interesting yesterday in my email, I got the ad for Jeff Salingo's new book, There Is Life After College. Of course there's life after college. You know, it's sort of like, this is insight and tips for all students at any age, and so they can calm their parents down and assure them that they're going to get get a job after their degree. I really don't like that, and I know in many contexts there's an employability focus, and of course I want my learners to get a job at the end, but I really don't like thinking about university for a career. I like to think about what kind of learning might we facilitate across the learning career. So it's not just while they're on our campuses, but to me that kind of thinking will allow them to be successful as they move on. How can we make that more explicit? Contrast that with a new book by Randy Bass and Brett Eyman that's come out of AAC&U that's really thinking about, well, we've got all these new digital technologies, we live in a digital ecosystem, how can we truly leverage those ecosystems to support learning? So rather than, and they're actually pushing back a little bit against Salingo's earlier book, College Unbound, to say rather than unbundling education, you know, with MOOCs, et cetera, what they're advocating is a rebundling. How can we use all of those various technologies in an integrative way to help learners be more successful, which I quite like and think is, well, in my opinion, I haven't read this new book, but I think that that's a better way to think about higher education today. And so really considering those various ideas with what evidence would be compelling to the various stakeholders in that broader ecosystem that the work that our learners are doing in portfolios is meaningful and valuable. And so Helen and I, you know, when we were writing our book, we're brainstorming who would those folks be, and you can see anywhere from the people on our campuses, both academic affairs and student affairs professionals, but also our boards of trustees, alumni, employers, etc. How can we engage all of those folks in a conversation and make sure that the things that we're saying about portfolios make sense to those stakeholders who are coming from quite different contexts? And I know for me, that's been a challenge throughout my career working at universities, to really think through how can I convince a provost or a dean that this kind of work would be useful for them and useful for their students. What kind of language and framing do I need to use? How can we design the activities so that the artifacts that are in the portfolio, the evidence, is the kind of evidence that is compelling to those particular groups? You know, when I talk to engineers about portfolios, you know, they don't necessarily use the language of reflection. You know, and I remember early on sort of saying, ooh, this would be so great for the engineers, and they're like, yeah, we don't do reflection. And I said, oh, well, if you have design documents, right, design rationale documents, oh yes, those are really important. I'm like, well, that's a reflective document. So they were doing that work, but we're just not calling it reflection. And so, you know, allowing the students to use evidence that made sense in that context was really important. And here you can see from Simone's example of how she's bringing all of this together. Her portfolio was really to document her abilities and her learning in a global competency certificate that we offer at TRU. And you know, she's bringing together her study abroad experience and the learning in courses to present a picture of who she is as a learner with respect to global competency that is accessible to somebody outside the university because she's connecting it to the kind of abilities that, for instance, an employer might want to see. Similarly, Emily did this. She won a TRU Learning Award this year for bringing together the learning and reflecting on how the learning that had occurred for her at TRU really mapped to our strategic priorities. And so what I love about her portfolio, she's a visual arts and philosophy major, so she's got this double major, but she's really thinking also beyond the institution to sort of say, what is my mission? What do I want to do in the future? And I really want to, you know, make contributions to my community in meaningful ways. And throughout her portfolio, she makes those connections for folks so that they understand where she's coming from. So we've been doing this kind of work a lot, and I think the idea of illuminating learner pathways has become more present for me as I see more and more portfolios over time. I think that we've got some really good examples emerging, and I heard these yesterday. Rachel, where's Rachel from Loughborough, is that right? Yeah, Rachel. You know, when you presented pedagogy, which I loved, you know, I thought, oh, okay, that's portfolio as the curriculum, right? And that's, Kathy Yancey in the US has been making this case that really, if the portfolio isn't at the basis of the curriculum, it's not really good portfolio practice. And so I thought your example, really, you know, you've done that kind of thinking. How can we really embed it, integrate it into all of the things that the students are doing? There's some good examples of this in the US as well. The University at Buffalo, they spent the last couple of years really thinking about their general education curriculum and really mapping out a pathway for their learners so that they can sort of see, here's what I'm going to be doing as I move through my gen ed requirements. Here are their opportunities for them to kind of decide. I'm not going to stay in that box exactly. I have opportunities to go out based on my interests and things. And I think they've done quite a nice job. It'll be interesting to see. They're just launching this fall. So, but I have great hopes because I think they've done really smart thinking about how to integrate the portfolio and this kind of thinking throughout gen ed. A little bit of a different example comes from IUPUI in the US, where, and this really strikes me as one of those 7 C's. You know, the 7 C's are embedded in this particular model because their conceptual model really asks students to think about what's their character, who are they as individuals, how are they developing. So it's quite a different model, not necessarily connected to courses, but connected to the abilities that they want to see their learners and their graduates embody when they leave IUPUI. And they're using this in a couple of different contexts, not across the whole institution, but I think it's still quite exciting. This is our example from Thompson Rivers University that's, I know, really crazy busy and you can't read it. But we developed a prototype for this pathways idea where we aligned learning outcomes to our strategic priorities are what you see down the side. So research capacity, student success, intercultural capacity. And we developed really clear learning outcomes for each of those levels that are at the discover, connect, experience, become. Those were our levels, not first year, second year, third year, fourth year, because we wanted to open up space for learners to be able to tell us where were they at in that trajectory on that pathway. We might have a mature student coming back to start a program as a beginner in the program, but maybe had been an entrepreneur and run their own company. Well, they're not going to discover entrepreneurial ability, right? They're going to be more. And so the idea is that we would allow students to submit evidence that they met the learning outcomes at these different levels in a way that made sense to them so they could start to document and plan. And for us, it was a way of tying the portfolio initiative to the strategic priorities and mission of the institution to make more visible. You know, the president said to me, how can we show that we're meeting our strategic priorities? So this was a way of trying to capture some of that evidence. And these we also have rubrics that go along with all of the outcomes so that we can assess that evidence in a meaningful way. I think we do need to move beyond, though, just our work in higher education. We often see that we have cross-sector conversations, you know, high school to higher ed to workplace and community, but we don't do a good job, I don't think, of having conversations across the sectors. And it seems to me if we're really thinking about developing pathways, we ought to be thinking, how can we make sure that what's happening in secondary school really transfers into higher ed and then out into workplace and community in a way that is quite meaningful and seamless for the students. That involves having very different conversations than I think we typically have on our campuses, because you have to get those stakeholders talking across. And often what I'm finding is they don't share the same kind of language or the same kinds of goals or outcomes. And so how can we get on the same page? So this is a project, research and innovation in personal pathways and portfolios for learning is what Ripple means, that really is sort of hinged on, we're redesigning the BC education curriculum at the elementary and secondary school level. So it was a real opportunity for us to think about how could we start having these more meaningful conversations. And so we're doing that kind of thinking in terms of how do we connect the pathways across those various sectors. How do we develop capability for innovative workplaces? So, you know, as a historian, that kind of think, well, what the heck does that mean as a historian? But what are the knowledge practices that we all engage in our disciplines that we can then have students be able to transfer out into those various contexts? And again, going back to the employers say we must do a better job of critical thinking, et cetera, really infusing that into the whole process. And we really want to develop these more effective formats for learners to develop their knowledge and their capabilities across these contexts. And we want to think about new ways of presenting more traditional soft skills. It's already come up. Soft skills is just a terrible word because they're really difficult to develop, and it's not something that, oh, I've learned how to do teamwork, check. Again, it's an ongoing ability that we need to develop, and so how do we really work with not only the employers and community organizations, but also make sure that we're providing opportunities for students to begin to think about those, that kind of learning, to reinforce it, and then to continue on developing their proficiency as they move through university. So I think there's a lot of opportunity here for us to do really interesting things with portfolios, more interesting, even more interesting than we've already been doing. How do we get there, though? And I think for me, modeling the process that we want our students to embody is essential. In one of the sessions I was in yesterday, there was a conversation about, does everyone doing portfolio work have their own portfolio? If you don't, I'm going to suggest to you that you need to develop one right away. I don't think we can ask our learners to engage in practices that we aren't engaging in ourselves. Not only does it help you to better understand the kinds of things they might encounter when they're using PebblePad, but it also gives you credibility. You know, you can show your learners, here's my portfolio, here's how I'm still learning, oh, here's how I had a bit of a fail or success, if you want to think about the LASAC, it did get blown up in a bit of a non-traditional way. So I really think that we need to be modeling this process for our learners, and that's the I am still learning. We all should still be learning, and we should be making that obvious and evident to everyone else. I think we do need to engage stakeholders very broadly in this process of thinking. Learning organizations are challenging to change. We know that the work that we do sometimes doesn't feel valued on our campuses, or maybe people don't quite understand it. So having those conversations and encouraging those stakeholders to engage in that process of still learning themselves is essential. And I think, how do we empower stakeholders to take up these kinds of approaches is really the question that I'm wrestling a little bit with, and so I bet you have lots of great ideas. And then I think we do need to think about our beyond our campuses, because what we do on our campuses, of course, is super important, but we really do want to develop people who will contribute to the world in meaningful ways. And to me, that's a moral imperative that we have. We ought to be ensuring that our learners are able and equipped to go out and serve in the world in ways that we would be proud to say that was my learner. And that's really who we're doing this work for. And so I commend you for the work that you're doing, and look forward to hearing more today about all of your great projects. Thank you.